Peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In this video, I will be talking about the importance of the Sunnah. Because the reality is that you don't have no Qur'an without the Sunnah. Not because I said so, but because Allah says in the Qur'an, in Surah chapter 16, verse 44, it says, "And with clear signs and books we sent the messengers. And we have also sent down to you, O Muhammad, the dhikr, that you may explain it clearly to the men what is sent down to them, and that they may give thought." So the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he came to explain the dhikr, the Quran, the book, to us. For example, Allah talks about performing wudu in the Quran, right? But he doesn't give us the clear explanation of how to do it. Yeah, it says wipe your heads and wipe your hands and your forearms and your feet, but it doesn't tell us in the order or the sequence to do it. It doesn't get a very descriptive explanation of it. And then the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam explains that to its totality, right? The same way with salah. Allah says in the Quran to pray, right? It says to stand, to bow, to prostrate, but it doesn't give us the full detailed explanation of all the movements in the salah, right? So the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam explains that, right? In another verse, Allah says in the Quran, it says, in the same chapter 16 verse 64, it says, "And we have not sent down the book to you, O Muhammad, except that you may explain clearly to them those things in which they differ, and as a guidance and a mercy for folk who believe." So Allah says in another verse in the same chapter, is basically reiterating the same thing, that the book came down to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam so that he may explain it to us clearly, so that we understand what it is that we need to do. There are some people who think we don't need the Sunnah, and they get into these whole conversations, but without the Sunnah, you're definitely not going to understand the Quran, right? Because you need it. Allah is telling you in the Quran. This is not what I'm saying. This is what Allah is telling you. In another verse, it says in verse 4, in chapter 4, verse 65, it says, "But no, by your Lord, they can have no faith until they make you," talking about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "until they make you a judge in all disputes between them, and find in themselves no resistance against your decisions, and accept them with full submission." Now, Allah is saying you can have no faith until you accept the Prophet, the judgment of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we find no resistance in the decisions that he has made. Now, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he has passed away. So how is he a judge in our disputes today? He's a judge by us adhering to his Sunnah. When we have an issue or a disagreement, we refer back to the Quran and the Sunnah of his Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So one of the things I dislike the most is when I try to give somebody advice, admonition, and I tell them about what Allah says in the Quran, or I tell them about what the Prophet says in his Sunnah, and they neglect it and disregard it, right? At that point, I don't even want to even indulge with you, because it's like, this is clearly the things that we have to do in our religion. And another verse, it says, in the same chapter, chapter 4, verse 80, it says, "He who obeys the messenger has indeed obeyed Allah. And he who turns away, then we have not sent you, O Muhammad, as a watcher over him." So Allah is telling in the Quran, right? He who obeys the messenger has obeyed Allah. How do you obey the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? You obey him by following his Sunnah, his tradition. So clear indication that Allah is telling us the importance of obeying the messenger. And how do we obey the messenger today? Because he's no longer alive with us physically, is by following his Sunnah. In another verse, it says, the only saying of the faithful, this is chapter 24, verse 51. It says, "The only saying of the faithful believers when they are called to Allah and his messenger to judge between them is that they say, 'We hear and we obey,' and such are the successful." So in another verse, a lot of times when you see in the Quran, obey Allah, you're always going to see obey his messenger. That's the importance of the Sunnah. Again, I'm going to say it. You don't have no Quran without the Sunnah. The messenger came to explain the book and how to apply Islam. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was considered the walking Quran. This is what his wife Aisha said about him when they asked her what was his character like. She said he was the walking Quran. So this is how much he came to explain and break down the religion to us. So Allah is telling us that the only saying that the believers have when you call them to Allah and His Messenger, when you call them to the Qur'an and the Sunnah, is that they say, we hear and we obey. And that's it. It should be no other rebuttal after that. Right? Unless it's coming with another verse, or maybe the verse was abrogated, or it's coming with another Sunnah, you know. But other than that, it's nothing that we should be saying. And the last verse I'm going to share with y'all is chapter 33, verse 36. It says, it is not for a believer, man or woman, when Allah and His Messenger have decreed a matter, that they should have an option in their decision. And whosoever disobeys Allah and His Messenger, he has indeed strayed into plain error. So based on these verses that I just recited to y'all could go look them up yourself. Y'all could go look up the tafsir on your own, study them, whatever you choose to do. I just came here to give you the information. Based on these verses that I just recited to you, is a clear indication of how we need to obey the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because the Sunnah explains the Qur'an, which is the message of Allah, and His Messenger is the one who He sent to explain the book to us. So hopefully I said something that's beneficial. Hopefully I said something that helps us become better in our disputes with each other and in practicing Islam to its totality. And if I said anything that was wrong, it came from me, and anything beneficial came from Allah and the knowledge that He has blessed with me. May y'all continue to have a blessed Ramadan. Ramadan Mubarak. Have a good one. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.